Hello and welcome to another episode of Professional Book Girl. My name is Kayla and I read a ton of books so that I can recommend the best to you. And today is a very exciting episode. It is our first ever Professional Book Girl book club meeting. So if you're just tuning in for the first time on this episode, or honestly because this is the first book club, we all are kind of new here. I am new here also, just figuring this out as we go. This is a special kind of quote unquote bonus episode. It is not out on a Monday, so you're getting 2 episodes from me this week. Just how lovely for everybody. But this is very different from the main Monday episodes of the show because this episode is going to include spoilers. And I am just going to say that right now. I do not want any DMs that things were spoiled because that is the whole point of this episode. So getting that out of the way. Our January book club pick was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. And I just want to kind of pat myself on the back because I feel like this was a really great book club pick. If you are in a book club and don't know what to pick next, maybe choose this. I think it sparked a lot of conversation. And I just want to thank all of you for participating, everybody who did. And even if you're just tuning in to listen now, thank you. When I decided I wanted to do this as a bookstagrammer, and since I've been on Bookstagram for 5 years, doing some type of book club thing has always been in the back of my head, but I'm not, like I mentioned when I launched the book club, I'm not big on group chats or anything like that. So I wasn't sure how to make it work. But when I started my own podcast, I thought it just made so much sense for us to be like, hey, this is what we're reading. And then now I'm going to talk about it and you are going to get all of my thoughts. And I do have 2 listeners submitted their thoughts, which is very exciting because if you've been listening to past episodes of the show, I was worried nobody would participate. But beyond that, so many of you were DMing me that you were reading along. So many people commented when I posted it was the book club pick that you guys had either read and loved it, or people were saying oh, I've been meaning to read this. Maybe now this is my sign, which is honestly why I chose it because I had been meaning to read it. But a huge, I would say from my DMs, really, it was a pretty mixed bag on where everybody landed with this book, which is also why I think it's a great book club pick because that means it makes for interesting discussions and conversations. So I gave this book 3 stars, which I don't think 3 stars is a bad rating. That means that I liked this book. I will say I will not be keeping it on my shelf. I am going to donate it. I just didn't feel that connection and love, and I just don't really feel like I need it. But it was very interesting to me because I'm kind of bouncing around all over the place here, and that is what this episode will be. So I guess before I continue that train of thought, I'm going to cover this book tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, kind of similarly to how I do on a normal episode, but it will just be filled with spoilers. So while I was reading, I took notes, and they were very, very vague notes. One of them literally just says flashbacks dash I liked. So I'm just going to be using those to jog my memory and I guess tell the full story of the book and what I thought of it, because that is why we are all here. That being said, I think that this book is a really great example of when books are super hyped up on the internet, both by bookstagrammers and also just by normal people who are not part of the bookish community. Something that is very interesting to me is I'm sure so many of you who are readers do this too. When you're out in public and you see someone reading, you kind of clock what they're reading. And since I live in New York, a big thing is subway books. And Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow was such a huge, huge subway book. And when this book first came out, I had no interest in it. I saw it was about video games and I was like, no, it's a no for me. I just was not interested in it. Even after seeing everybody rave about it, a lot of bookstagrammers that I loved, and after seeing it everywhere on the subway, and I in my last job, the girl who sat next to me would have it with her every single day, and she was like, oh my god, you should read it. Andy Cohen this summer was posting to his Instagram stories that he was so obsessed with it, and this happens to me a lot with books that are getting a lot of play on both Bookstagram, but also then when I'm seeing it being translated into real life, you kind of just get worn down. I think everybody has had an experience like that, whether it's a book or a show or something. So I was like, okay, I will add this to my 24 and 24 stack. And then when I decided to do the book club podcast, I was like, this just seems like it's a good pick because I figured so many of you had already read it. And then a lot of you were kind of like me, where it's something that you had always been hearing about and been curious about. So like I said, though, I always was like, when I first heard it, I was like, no, like I don't think it's for me. I will say in this instinct, my gut was correct. It's very funny with books like this where I'm initially like, no, and then I get swayed. Most of the time, I don't love them. Like I can't really think of any like 5-star reads that I've had that I initially was like, I don't think I would like that book. And actually, back in the day on my former podcast, Books in the City, Emily covered this book and it still didn't pique my interest then. And actually, something we used to do when we finished recording was if someone was interested in the book, we would ask them to just tell us everything that happens in it. And I was like to Emily, like, I'm never going to read it. Just tell me everything that happened. And she did. And I forgot. Like, even when I was reading this, I was like, I don't even remember any of this being things that she said to me. So I think I can say that I'm glad that I read it just because like this book came out a while ago and you still see it everywhere. And so now it's like, I know what it's about and I feel like I can be part of that conversation. And it's like, I gave it a shot, but my gut was correct. Like this just was not a Kayla book, but sometimes I'm like very surprised and I end up enjoying something like this. Just before I sat down to record, I finished reading my book club pick, The Lost Flowers of Alice Hart, and I did not think I would like that book and I ended up really loving it and I gave it 4 stars. So you just you never know. But on the topic of hyped books, this one is very interesting specifically, and I've had this experience so many times when I disagree with the Bookstagram popular opinion. The second, first of all, I cannot remember ever seeing a negative review for this book on Bookstagram. And I like the way I operate on K Read What, I'm sure you guys realize this by now, like, and maybe you don't realize it's a conscious thing, but I don't post negative reviews for the same reason. I told you guys I don't really love covering books I didn't like here because it's just more fun to talk about books that you like. So I'm sure there were people that were feeling how I did and just weren't posting about it. But with a book like this that is getting so much playtime on Bookstagram, sometimes you will seeing like unpopular opinions filter through, but I don't recall like seeing any unpopular. I'm saying unpopular opinion is not liking this because it seems like the majority of people like this book, but I don't get it. Like I just it didn't work for me. But usually though, when I will come out on K Read What and say I didn't like this very hyped up Bookstagram book, my DMs get flooded with people being like, oh, I felt the same. And it's kind of validating for me because sometimes when there's a book that everybody loves and you don't love it, you're like, what is like, am I the problem? But no, like we are all very different and have very different tastes and opinions. And I think that's the magic of books. And I don't think everyone needs to feel the same way about a book because then it's kind of not fun. But it's validating when suddenly I'm never scared to say I don't like a book because I'm just so like, I've been doing this for 5 years now, but it is validating when people start messaging and being like, I'm feeling the same way. And I know some of you were messaging me as you were reading it, like, I just can't get into this. And I was like, I felt the same way. I had the same experience. I also want to say though, if you loved this book, I'm very happy for you. Like, good for you. If anything, I am jealous. One of my biggest Bookstagram pet peeves is like, when people get sad that I didn't like a book that they read, which I get it because it's like, oh, I really love this. Like, it sucks it didn't work for you, but it's like, whatever. Like, it is what it is. That's life. We don't all like the same things. So if you liked this, I'm in no way like coming for you. I feel like I should have to cover my bases because you never know. Like, people just got upset about things, but I wish that I loved this. I wish it was a 5-star read. It just was not. And I'm very happy for everyone that it was. It just didn't click for me. And it just wasn't my thing. But yeah, I guess it is time to keep talking really about this book tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow. So I am going to talk about this in a very convoluted, maybe confusing if you didn't read it way, because as I was taking notes, I was just like, I said weird bullet points that I'm just going to go down that list. So I guess the like elevator pitch for this book is that it is about 2 people. I forgot their names. Sam and Sadie, who they met when they were children in a hospital. And actually, like I said, when I read that one bullet point that I wrote, I really like the flashback. So what ends up happening is Sam was in a major accident as a child, and you don't find out the specifics of it until later in the book. And his foot was like pretty much destroyed and they had to rebuild it. and he was nonverbal since the accident. Like I think they were like 8 or 9, like they were very young. And Sadie, the girl, her sister is sick with like it's like kind of known that it's non-life threatening, but she is sick and in the hospital. And Sadie's at the hospital a lot because of that. And her and her sister got in a fight, and her mom like sends her out to the waiting room. And one of the nurses is like, oh, like you can go in here and play video games. And Sam is there playing video games. And the two of them just completely hit it off. And they already both love video games. They are both very smart children. Sam starts speaking for the first time, really comes to life. And you find out, though, that Sadie, I forgot the like specifics of it, but basically because she was making her bat mitzvah, she had to do community service, and they were like, oh, like your hours like quote unquote volunteering at the hospital will count towards the community service. So she is like keeping a log of how many hours she spends with Sam, and she in her head though like she ends up winning like an award at the synagogue for how many hours of community service she did. Like they say the number was like in the high like hundreds and hundreds, you know, because they're like they become best friends. And then Sam eventually finds out, and he kind of takes it the way you would expect, but he was very stubborn, which is something that I think kind of continues throughout the book. And he doesn't want to speak to Sadie then, and he is like, you were just using me for community service, whatever. And then they just go their separate ways. I think like it seems like in high school they kind of cross paths at conferences, but they just didn't speak until when the book opens up in 1995. Right before that, though, I do want to say there's a table of contents, which I really enjoyed. I love a table of contents because when I read, I am diagnosed with OCD, and I am obsessive about knowing how many pages are left in a chapter. So the second I start a chapter, I have to like count and see how many pages are left in it. And usually, even as I'm reading the chapter, I'm still counting to see how many pages are left in it. And I found that I just like a table of contents. It makes that like a little bit easier for me, you know. And this was also split into multiple parts. And at first I was like, oh fuck, like is it going to be no chapters, just giant parts like Curtis Sittenfeld does in some of her books? But it wasn't. They're like nicely nice, what is the word I'm looking for, like nice short chapters within these larger parts. So the table of contents helped me because I'd be like, oh, when do I get to the next part? Like that's when I'll take a break, or that's when I'll stop reading for the day. This book also took me, I want to say like 3 days to read, which is maybe for me like the norm is 1 to 2. So also for a book of this size, I felt that was a little bit long for me, but we'll get into that. So um on that note too, the writing, I think the writing is very beautiful, and I think part of why people rated this book so highly, it is extremely well written. Also, we follow them for like most of their lives, so there's something to say about forming these characters so fully and so fleshed out that you really feel like you know them. And I think that's testament to the writing. And if I was rating it on just the writing alone, I probably would have given it like more stars, but it did take me a bit to get into the writing style, and I felt like the way it was written slowed it down for me in a bit. Like I'm an extremely fast reader, but sometimes it's like my brain kind of couldn't like download the format quick enough for me to read at my normal pace. But anyway, the book opens though in 1995 when they're on the T, I think it's called the T in Boston, the like subway there, on the platform, and Sam sees Sadie and he like calls her name across the platform, and it's like this kind of cute moment, and they realize that he's studying at Harvard, she's at MIT, and she gives him, or he gives, I think she gives him like a video game she had made for class, and then it kind of all kicks off from there. So basically what ends up happening is Sam has the idea for the two of them to make a video game together, and they end up doing that, and it is very successful, and they go on to form their own gaming company, and that's pretty much what this book is about the video games. And there are very like there's real life things involved in there as well, but the video games are the crux of it all, which I'm not going to get into that right this second. So part 2, I really enjoyed part 1. Part 2 was slower for me because I wasn't interested in what went into building a video game. my favorite character was Marks, who starts off as Sam's roommate and becomes Sadie's eventual partner. He is really like a prominent part in part 2, so I enjoyed like those parts of it. But reading about them kind of pulling all-nighters and plotting the game and like the story of the game, I just wasn't into that. And I guess we're just going to get into the video game conversation of it all now. So I was told so many times, like since this book came out, by so many different people, that you don't have to be into video games to like this book. And now having read it, I would say that that's true. But I think if you have like if I liked video games more, I would have liked this more. Like my life with video games was like I had a Nintendo DS. Obviously, we had a Nintendo 64, which was like very cool back in the day in our house. But like I wasn't obsessed with playing it. Like we had a GameCube. I was really into like Mario Party, obviously Just Dance, Nintendogs, Animal Crossing on the DS was like my shit. Sims on the DS, like I stopped playing like any video game when I was like 13, and I actually regret I sold my DS and all of the games at GameStop in the mall because I wanted to buy myself a pair of Uggs. So in the moment, I was glad that I did that, but looking back sometimes I'm like, oh, like maybe it'd be cool to like check in on my Nintendogs, but I'm just not a gamer. I've never been into those like long story games. I've never played Dungeons and Dragons or anything like that. Every now and then, um like I've in college and stuff, people would put Mario Kart, maybe play like Mario Kart or something, but I'm just not into video games, and I don't care about what goes into building a video game. And it is an art form, and like I learned so much about that in this book, but it just is not really interesting to me. I found it to be kind of boring, and specifically with the first game that they built, I didn't know any of the references, like the artwork for it, like I didn't know any of that, and I didn't feel the sense of like, oh, like this is cool and I'm learning about it. I was like, I kind of just don't care. Like I cared more about there would be like these flashbacks and you were like, oh, like Sam and Sadie are like not talking in the future. And I was like, well, what happened there? Like that's what I cared about. I didn't care about the video games at all, but the video games and like their company is really like the main character of this book. Like it is such a through line through the whole thing. And on the video games note, on an episode a few weeks ago, I told you guys about the Oregon Trail. And I was like, I can picture playing the Oregon Trail in elementary school. And it's also like, I didn't tell you guys this part before, but it was a very vivid memory because the boy sitting next to me, he had like just transferred in, and he was very, very cute and went on to become like one of like the very like local celebrities in your high school, because of how cute he was. But this was an elementary school, and he had like just moved to the school, and he was sitting next to me, and so we were talking about it, and it just like seared in my brain. But I hate the Oregon Trail, the game, and the actual real life historical thing. It stresses me out so much I can't even think about it, and I feel like it is because in a past life I died on the Oregon Trail, just because of that like visceral reaction I have to whenever the Oregon Trail comes up. So I told you guys about that on an episode of this podcast, and then I choose this book, right, as the book club pick. And my Aunt Sue texted me, and she was like, are you reading the book club? Are you reading Tomorrow yet? And I was like, no, not yet. And she was like, okay. And then when I got to that part, I was like, is this what you were talking about? Because the Oregon Trail is mentioned so many times in this book. I was like, oh my God, like just what are the odds of me publicly coming out as someone who in a past life died on the Oregon Trail, and then picking this book where like it comes up nonstop, the Oregon Trail. And as you guys know, like I just could not with the Oregon Trail. Like it's maybe that's part of why I didn't like this book. It was like too PTSD for me to read about the Oregon Trail so much. But with the video game stuff too, I did enjoy kind of the corporate political nature of like them choosing the type of games that they wanted to play, and when they were selling the video game, and like obviously Sadie was the only woman in the room, and I thought that was very interesting. Also the teacher Dov, like I hated him, like sleazeball scumbag, I hate you. Like just hated when he was on the page, just like gross. And that's all I have to say about him. But I did enjoy that part of it. And when Sam and Sadie would kind of argue about what game to make next, and I found it interesting when he made that one that like he was the mayor or something. Like Sam's progression throughout the book, I did find interesting, and I kept being. At first, I would be surprised by some of his actions as an adult. And then I would think, though, like, this is who he is. And maybe I didn't think that at first because we met him as this child in a very vulnerable position, but he kind of is like manipulative and maybe not. I feel like he's not the greatest guy in the way that I assumed he was in the beginning. Um, but anyway, my my next little bullet point is some books slow my pace, and this one did. The way it was written took me seconds to process, which I already covered. In parts 4 and 5, I got bored with it and I wasn't able to slip into the story. And this is something that when it doesn't even need to be a book that I love for me to slip into it, but most of the, I would say like 90 to 95% of the time when I'm reading, I'm kind of able to exactly what I said, slip into the story. I don't know any other way to explain it. And that is when you don't even realize that you're reading and you are just, there are no outside thoughts, nothing else is distracting you, and you're just like fully immersed within the book. And I could not do that with this book. I kept checking my phone, my mind kept wandering, I kept drifting off. I kept wondering how long it would take me to be done. I got to a point where I wanted the book to be over. I was getting bored. I couldn't wait to finish it. And that is like not a great thing to happen when you're reading. I don't think I ever would have DNF'd it though. And I don't think that in the future, I'm not opposed to DNFing the book club picks because I think that is an accurate real life reading scenario then. So if I really hated this and I DNF'd it, I still would have, I had already picked it. So I wouldn't have finished it just because it was the book club pick is what I'm trying to say, I guess. I want to talk about the shooting. So when it got to the point where I thought it was interesting the way that they foreshadowed the shooting, how they were kind of like, oh, you didn't hear, like Sam and Sadie were off at a conference or something, and they're like, you didn't hear, like there is an active shooter here. I don't care for reading, watching, consuming shootings in media. And I think that this is something that other Americans might feel. And I know that there are people listening who are not American, which is like a very cool thing. Like PBG is worldwide. But living in this country in this day and age, like I don't care for it. Like, and I didn't always feel like that. So I've been thinking a lot over, because I read this book like almost 3 weeks ago now. And I've been thinking about how I wanted to address the shooting. And I think I don't know if this is even the best way, but this is how I want to talk about it. So that's what I'm doing. Back in the day, there was a shooting episode of One Tree Hill, and that was like, I will never forget watching that. And it just seemed unfathomable to me. And I already had learned about Columbine. My middle school had Rachel's Promise or something. It was one of the victims, Rachel. I think she might have been the last student that was killed that day. Her parents started this thing where they like toured the country and would speak in schools, and they came and they spoke to my whole school during the school day. And then there was another assembly at night where the parents were invited to go. And my best friend at the time, her mom brought us, and we were just so like, I remember finding it so interesting the way that I found learning about the Holocaust so interesting, in the sense of like, how is this possible? And at the time when I was 12 in like 2007, it still seemed so impossible that it was like fascinating in like a fucked up way, right? And then a few years later, I saw the shooting episode of One Tree Hill, and then there was the shooting episode of Grey's Anatomy. And I think about that shooting episode of Grey's Anatomy frequently when I think about this fucking state of this country and guns, because when that episode happened, that was like appointment television. And at the time in my Grey's Anatomy career, me and my friend group were obsessed. I would watch it every Thursday night with my mom and my sister. Most weeks, my best friend would come over and watch it with us. Like it was our show. And the night of that shooting episode, everyone in my house sat down and watched it. Like my brother and I've never talked about this publicly, I guess, but my mom adopted my cousin. So like both boys were like sitting and watching it with us, and like no one could move. We were so riveted. And it's crazy to think back now. And it was like entertainment watching a shooting like that. And then I remember like the next day going to school and everyone was talking about that episode. And then either that day or that weekend, my aunt and uncle came to visit from out of state, and we all sat and watched that episode again. And I think about that a lot because I feel like we wouldn't do that now, because you just hear about these things so often you can't even keep track of all of them. And it's not entertain it was I guess it was never entertaining, but it's even less entertaining now, and I don't even care for it for the shock factor or anything like that, because it is a very real, visceral thing that Americans have to deal with and have to be worried about. And I don't know why. Also, this week I was thinking about 9/11. And something that I learned recently in like the last few years, because I asked my mom, a thing people do in New York and in the tri-state area is like talk about where they were on 9/11. I'm sure people do in like other parts of the country, but like the states that were like really fully impacted, like my community where I grew up on Long Island was extremely impacted by 9/11. And as the years go on, like people, you talk about it and you share your experiences and your stories of that day. And just talking to people like as an adult about it, I've realized, like, because I was in first or second grade. I was in first grade. No, I think I was in, I don't know. I was in first or second grade. But most people will say like they were picked up from school, but I wasn't picked up from school. And I asked my mom recently, I was like, why didn't you pick me up from school? And like my brother and my sister weren't in school yet, so they were home. And she was like, because at the time in my head, that was the safest place in the world for you to be, at school. And I don't think any American parent would say that today. And I might sound like I'm laughing. I'm not. It is so fucked up. And that is just like a very like long and convoluted way of saying like, I don't I don't enjoy like reading about shootings. I read 19 Minutes by Jodi Picoult maybe like 6 months ago, and I didn't like it the way that a lot of people did. And I was like, because I'm reading this now and not when it came out. And it's just not, it feels gross to me to almost like read about something like this for entertainment. And I know that also sounds so weird when I read books about war and all these other horrible things. But for me, with this book, I understand why there was a shooting, I guess, but it didn't feel necessary to me. I thought it was interesting the way that actual real life politics came to be an issue with their company, and that seemed very real. And the shooting seemed real in the sense of, I'm sure that is something that has happened and something that would have happened if this company was real, but I just didn't care for it being added in here. And it got to a point for me where this book started to feel a little bit like trauma porn, because we have a shooting. We have Sadie's abusive relationship with an older male authority figure in her life. Sam's mother is deaf. Sam's foot getting it amputated, and it just felt like one thing after another. And by the time we got to the shooting, I literally was like, of course now there's a shooting. Like, what else are you going to throw in here? It's just, I really just did not like it. And that's all I'm going to say about it. And I also didn't like it because my favorite character died. But the aftermath of the shooting I found to be interesting, with Sadie and her pregnancy and everything with that, and the fallout of Sam and Sadie's relationship. And also like this book and everything between Sam and Sadie was just one giant miscommunication. And I hate that. I hate the miscommunication trope. Yeah, let's go through the other trauma issues. So the amputation I thought was interesting. Like, I've never read anything about that. My only reference point really was like Grey's Anatomy after the plane crash when Arizona has to get an amputation. So I guess it made sense in this story, but I was kind of just like, okay, like it was a little random. Sam's mom, I really enjoyed her story and reading about that. Thought it was very interesting, like who his dad was, the move from New York. And that was another traumatic thing, like watching a woman commit suicide. The accident was like so upsetting. It was devastating, but it made a lot of sense for the story and for who Sam was. And I enjoyed those flashback chapters to that story and leading. I didn't enjoy reading about her death, but I enjoyed reading about her life, I would say. Okay, so then in the aftermath of the shooting, Sam and Sadie aren't really talking, and he creates this homestead game, which is basically like the Oregon Trail again. And I hated that. Like, I hated that part. I actually, like, I skimmed through it because I just did not care. And I was like, what the hell is happening? When you learn that he created that game to find her and communicate with her, and that the Easter egg that Marks was in there like did make me tear up, but I just did not care. Like I was like no. And like how did we go from like the emotional trauma of a shooting and now you're just reading like avatars wandering around in a game? Like just did not do it for me. Like I mentioned, Sam and Sadie really frustrated me, and I was told by so many people on the internet and real life that it's not a love story. Because I guess when I first heard about it, and this is me having internalized misogyny for a second, I assumed it was about two guys when I heard about video games, and like fully owning up to that bad feminist moment that I had. I was just like, oh, it's about two guys. And then someone was like, no, like it's a guy and a girl, but it's about their friendship. And people will say like this is a story of friendship, and then when you realize that Sam was in love with Sadie the whole time, I was like, what the fuck? Like it made no sense to me. I was like, I understand why Sadie like didn't really see it, because I was like, first of all, why were so many people telling me it's about a friendship when like very clearly at the end he has feelings for her? And I was like, I don't understand that at all. And I don't, going into it knowing it was a friendship and then suddenly finding out he had feelings, I think I still would have been like, no, I know I still would have been like, what the fuck? Like he has feelings for her, because it just felt like it kind of came out of nowhere. To me, their platonic relationship and like really what like the heart of their relationship is that they were both kids who met in vulnerable times going through something traumatic, and they bonded over the thing that they love, but also the thing that made each of them special individually and together. And there was just, I never caught vibes between them, you know, like Sadie and Marks, yeah. And I was so happy when they finally got together, but I just did not like understand that at all. Like I mentioned, they both frustrated me. Sam probably more so. I liked how Sadie ended up kind of back at MIT teaching. It seemed like she had a lovely life with her daughter. I did like that I really liked Sam's grandparents and like the pizza restaurant and the Donkey Kong of it all. And I liked that she inherited the Donkey Kong, and I thought it was sweet, like they're ending together in Boston, back where it all started. But yeah, like I don't know. So, like I said, I got to the point at the end where I was ready to be done. And I forgot that I felt like this, but I wrote parts I loved and was going to give it 4 stars, but then I lost interest. And I guess looking back, like that is how I felt. I kind of was on a roller coaster of interest the whole time I was reading it. I was definitely more into it in part 1. Part 2, I was like, what are we doing here? Then in like the company stuff, I thought that was interesting. Just kind of like their internal politics, but also watching like this company grow was interesting. But I just told you a million things I didn't like about it, so that's why I gave it 3 stars. I think this is the perfect example of a hyped book not working / you should follow your instinct despite hype. And I do want a last point on the video games. I'm just like making sure I cover everything I wrote down. The video games are written in a way that a non-gamer could understand. And so I do think that is like a feat of writing. Because like I told you guys, like my gamer career ended with Nintendogs 17 years ago. But so I understood everything with the games. I just wasn't interested in the things with the games. And I liked the metaphors that the games had for life. Like I guess at the end of the day, I would say this book is really a book about life. And maybe that's why there's so much trauma in it. But I even like that being said, it just still didn't really connect and click for me. And because it just didn't hold my interest throughout, like I was never going to come on here and say I love this when I had so many moments where I was like, okay, like enough, let's get the show on the road. So those are all of my thoughts. I obviously have a lot. I hope some of you agree. And if you don't, then that's cool too. Because I'm sure I don't agree with how you felt. We did have 2 listeners submit their thoughts, so I'm going to read that for you now, and they both are very different from mine. So here you're getting a different perspective, which this is why I wanted to have the book club episodes be. I wanted listener participation in it, because what's the fun of a book club if you're just hearing from one person? So our first message comes from Liz, who is a longtime bookish friend of mine and just the best. And she emailed me. She is psychic. She emailed me literally as I was sitting down to record this. She says, "Hi, Kayla. Full disclosure, I read this book last year, so my thoughts are rusty, but overall, I really love this book. I was afraid going into it because I'm not a huge gamer, so I was nervous that going into it that the references would go over my head. I'm happy to say that while I'm sure some references did overall, not being a gamer, it didn't really hurt my reading experience. I forgot the main characters' names, same, but I loved reading about them when they were young and how they ran into each other during college. The female main character's love choices drove me crazy when she was dating her professor slash mentor, whatever he was. And the game they designed sounded so cool and beautiful. The last sort of the book after the shooting was a lot. I remember listening to it while driving home from work and taking the long way home so I didn't have to stop reading. For me, it was 5 stars because I just had that 5-star feeling. Very rarely do I remember all my sense when listening to an audiobook, and basically I have a snapshot driving, remembering where I was going, where I was driving, the weather, etc. And this book gave that to me. Can't wait to see your thoughts and keep doing what next month's choices, which you guys will find out in a second. Thank you, Liz, for sharing that. And I think that also is what I didn't say, but the whole point is if you're reading this and you got the 5-star feeling, you got the 5-star feeling. Like, there's no rhyme or reason to when you get the 5-star feeling. So happy for Liz that she got it. And our last submission comes from Katie. She DM'd me and she says, I, all in caps, loved this book. While the premise of video games and designing them might be the least interesting thing to me, somehow this book kept me extremely interested and I couldn't stop reading. I loved all the character development throughout the book and oddly loved that Sam and Sadie didn't end up together. It made the story feel so real and relatable. I got this book as my Book of the Month 2022 pick, so thanks for convincing me to finally pick it up. I also got this book as the Book of the Month 2022 pick. So I think a lot of us who read it for this book club were kind of in the same situation I was, where it was like, I've had this forever. Let's just pick it up and see what it's about. So those are all of my thoughts on tomorrow. I had many thoughts, as you can tell. I feel like now with any book club, like the pressure's on for me to have a lot of thoughts about them, like I gotta fill this hour. But it is time to announce the February book club pick. And full disclosure, I had another book pick, but just before this episode, I was doing my hair and I was staring at my TBR pile and I saw this book on there and I was like, do you know what? I feel like this could be a good one. I've been seeing it on Bookstagram. It's been out for a few months now. It is The Frozen River by Ariel Lawhon. I am a little nervous to read this. It is a historical fiction, so that's not why I'm nervous, but I'm nervous because it seems like it's like a little naturey, which like not really my thing. And I have read another book by this author and didn't super love it, but I've had people message me about this book saying that they read it and thought of me. So that's why I decided to read it. And I've been seeing it all over the internet, all over Bookstagram. I think it's available from Book of the Month. It's been out since November, so hopefully you should be able to get it from your library. But I'm excited to do a historical fiction book, and yeah, maybe it'll be cool too, because there will be like real life, we get to talk about the real life history too. I just love that. Basically, this podcast is a way for me to fulfill my unfulfilled dream I had once of being a history teacher. But that is it for this episode. Thank you so much for reading along, for listening, for joining in on the January book club. I'm so excited I decided to do this. It is just so much fun. And just as a disclosure for next month, and I will be talking about this on every episode until the next book club episode. If you want to share your thoughts, you can do exactly what you just heard. Just send an email or a DM to Professional Book Girl or to KarenWatt, or email professionalbookgirlpod@gmail.com or KarenWatt@gmail.com. And I will just read off your thoughts like I did with this week's participants. But thank you guys so much for listening. I will see you on Monday in just a few days. And don't forget to pick up the February book club pick. Make sure you're following, subscribe, whatever you want, whatever podcast platform you're listening on. You can watch on YouTube. Follow me at KarenWatt, follow the show at Professional Book Girl. And I can't remember anything else. So that's it. Bye.